was a lot more paved in John's photos, but what struck me, what was surprising, was the similarities. Even the way the landslides looked, the rubble, the rocks, the boulders on the road, and the presence of excavators as well.
My trip was in mid-November 2019, about 13 months after Camilo's. I traveled roughly the same length from Goroka to Kundiawa and then up from there to Gembog. I think the landslides are something that the locals hope is sort of a temporary issue. My sense is that they hope in some way that the company or the contractors in charge of building the road can kind of shore up these constant landslides and that they won't be a permanent fixture. I remember picking up the bits of rock that had fallen in these landslides. Even the firmer pieces were sort of this really crumbly rock. You could just squeeze it in your hand, it would just fall apart. That made me realize how fragile in some ways these hillsides are when you start to cut into them like that. And as a result, it's hard to see that the landslides would stop anytime soon. Now, Camilo's photos showed that there were other rocks encased in a wire mesh, and these relatively neat-looking rows of barriers were put in place to hold up the hillside. But in several places, the landslide would tumble down over that or just push the barrier right up to the downslope side of the road. I'm no construction expert, but it looked to me like a relatively effective measure to hold back the hillside at first. But when there's enough rain, like there was the night I spent out there, it didn't work.
I mean, the general sentiment from the community, well, the communities I spoke to in Gembog and around it, was very positive. You know, they focused a lot on the economic side of it. You know, it would allow them to distribute their produce quicker and safer to the big markets. And secondly, obviously, it would decrease travel times, not just in general transport, like traveling around or anything like that, but in emergencies, you know, the links to the government services, to hospitals, to schools. So they saw all those positives.
I think in general, there's still a pretty high level of enthusiasm for the road. For them to have seen it paved, I think that was a big step. There's a certain standard of living associated with having a paved road through your community. I think people take some pride in that, even if it's not always passable. And then there were jobs created by having to move the landslides. It's not a huge number of people, but you know, to have 10 to 15 men on a crew helping to move rocks and dirt and debris from the road alongside the machinery. And then women get jobs too, directing traffic and that sort of thing. So in a place that's really cash poor in a lot of ways, that was seen as a benefit for a lot of folks I spoke with.
With any road, there's always that risk of having those extractive industries have easier access to it. Bear in mind that it's still quite rough terrain up around there, so they'd have to build yet another sort of access road, like a logging road, for example, if that were the case. Speaking to some community leaders about things like mining and logging impacts maybe in the future, they did raise it as a concern. Not everybody would be against it, but then there are some people that are thinking about those possibilities and doing it in the most, I guess, sustainable way possible.